It's the final day of the ASEAN summit, and leaders are holding their final sessions with their key partners, including Australia. Top of the agenda, likely to include Indo-Pacific security and strengthening economic relations. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has already vowed to deepen cooperation with the bloc, pledging $60 million to boost economic ties yesterday. He also emphasized the importance of the bloc to Australia.
The centrality of ASEAN is vital to Australia's future because Australia and ASEAN are bound by more than an accident of geography or the virtue of history. We share a common belief in the opportunities of this region, the potential of our peoples, and we hold a common responsibility to advance stability, peace and prosperity for every nation that calls Southeast Asia home.
We have with us Nicholas Moore, Australian Special Envoy for Southeast Asia. He joins us live from the JCC Media Centre in Jakarta. Now, Mr. Moore, ASEAN centrality, we heard there from Prime Minister Albanese. However, the level of economic engagement with Southeast Asia remains stubbornly low. Words like stagnant and underweight, lackluster have been used. Why is this? What are the main barriers to this?
Well, that was the subject of our report, and so we released it yesterday. The Prime Minister released it, setting a strategy in terms of how Australia can increase two-way trade and investment with the region between now and 2040. So we came up with 75 different recommendations. So dealing with your first question, why are we where we are, I think it's important to note that trade has been constant at about 14% of two-way trade and investment for Australia and the region in recent years. So trade has been consistent, but it hasn't grown at the same rate as the regional economies have been growing. So that's point one. Secondly, from an investment viewpoint, from a foreign direct investment viewpoint, we know a lot of foreign investment has come into the region, particularly in recent years. At the same time, particularly in the last few years, we've seen Australian foreign direct investment fall into the region. So the focus of the report is those two central facts, that trade has grown but not at the same rate as the region, and secondly, foreign direct investment from Australia has actually fallen. So we've asked ourselves, what can we do? What are the recommendations in terms of increasing both the trade and secondly, the investment?
And so, Mr. Moore, in breaking down these barriers, which sectors are the main priority for Australia?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So we've looked at the recommendations overall, and this is contained in the report here, and we've broken those recommendations down into four different categories. Number one was raising awareness, because frankly, it's been very good economic times for Australia and more broadly in recent times. And so a lot of the trade and investment, of course, has been focused on China and Europe and the United States. And so we think it's been the awareness of what's been happening in the region hasn't been as great as it could be. And so our number one group of recommendations focus on how we can increase awareness of the opportunities in the region from an Australian viewpoint, and secondly, how the region can see Australia and the opportunities from an Australian viewpoint. And one of the recommendations was accepted yesterday by the government when they released the report, to actually look at having a trade promotion program in Australia for Asian exports to Australia. So that was a great thing the Prime Minister announced yesterday amongst the three different measures that he was talking about. The second area of our report was focusing on the blockages in terms of what's stopping greater trade and investment. Now, we've got a great regional architecture that's been put in place over the last 20 years between Australia and the region, but there are still blockages that we highlight in the report, areas that we can make it easier for people to move between the two jurisdictions, people to work and their qualifications to be recognised across the jurisdictions, and in terms of the blockages to investment, not just a people movement, but also investment flowing. So we've got a group of recommendations in that area. And thirdly, we look at capability building. You know, the region has lots of opportunities. It needs skilled people. Australia has already participated and continues to participate in the building of skills for the region, particularly through our university sector. So today there's about 500,000 graduates of Australian universities in the region providing a lot of expertise and knowledge. The question is, how can we step that up going forward on a two-way basis? So it won't just be Australian universities, but universities located in the region, building a workforce that again is able to work in Australia and the region more broadly. And fourthly, in terms of our recommendations, we look at the investment question we talked about before. What can the Australian government do to assist and help in terms of boosting Australian investment into the region? So they're the four different categories. And as you say, we identify a number of critical industries and area for us to focus on. And a lot of those we've heard about in the last couple of days here in the forum. Things like the digital economy, of course, in terms of the energy transition, obviously a massive topic here in Jakarta. We focus on what Australia is doing, the needs, what's happening in the region, how we can work together. Traditional Australian strengths, of course, such as agriculture and commodities and universities more broadly. Looking at the visitor economy, tourism, of course, from a two-way viewpoint, and looking at the creative economy. There's some of the areas that we focused on, and it was terrific to hear, since we've been here, in terms of the priorities of the government here in Indonesia, very much reflecting those sorts of opportunities and those sorts of challenges from an Indonesian viewpoint and indeed from a regional viewpoint.
Mr. Moore, I want to look at migration policy because that's important. And one particular thorn in the side of some ASEAN businesses has long been visas. There are lots of anecdotes about very long waiting times. And as we know, time is money. So how soon can we expect to see some real change here to make it easier for business people to go to your country?
Yeah, well, visas was certainly highlighted. It was highlighted here in Indonesia and in the other countries that we visited. I should say what we did in terms of putting the strategy together. We looked at the top-down numbers, which were the sort that you referred to earlier. But secondly, it was very much a bottom-up review of actually talking to business leaders, governments, both in the region and in Australia, and asking them what are the barriers to further trade and investment. And we've met with over 750 individuals and we received over 250 submissions. And you're right that this question of access, both from Australia to the region and from the region to Australia, did come up. And the government's very aware of the issue of visas, and it's subject to a review taking place at the moment within the government. Now, important to say, this is a strategy we've talked about in terms of between now and 2040. These issues will need to be worked on and need to be worked through, and that's exactly what's happening. One of the very pleasing things is the fact that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister here in Jakarta have both launched the policy yesterday, and they've also announced that not only are they launching the policy, saying what the strategy is, but also committing the government to be reviewing the recommendations, particularly this one of visas that you mentioned. It's part of the migration review taking place at the moment, but with the review of the strategy not being static, but actually revisiting it annually. So look at the recommendations we're making today and seeing what progress have we made each year going forward. So certainly visas will be very central in terms of that review, I'm sure.
All right, Mr. Moore, that is all the time we have. It's a pleasure speaking with you. Nicholas Moore, Australian Special Envoy for Southeast Asia, speaking to us live from Jakarta.